Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Styliani Dialechti Voulgaropoulou will defend the academic thesis modeling the brain, mechanisms underlying the interplay between the multiple facets of stress and cognition. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Highly esteemed Prorector, members of the opposition, and supervisors, dear family, friends, and colleagues, thank you all for being here today for the defense of my dissertation entitled Modeling the Brain, Mechanisms Underlying the Interplay Between the Multiple Facets of Stress and Cognition. In the upcoming minutes, I will present you with a summary of my thesis and some of the work I have conducted during my time as a PhD. Everyone has experienced stress in their lives, from a job interview and a public talk, like me right now, to major life events such as the pandemic or even war. And stress can affect the way we think, our cognition, in many ways. So the aim of this thesis is to investigate the interaction between stress and cognition. But both stress and cognition are very broad terms that involve different facets or different dimensions. Of course, it's not possible to cover the full spectrum of possibilities, so only some examples are given here for simplicity. Stress, for example, may vary from acute or short-lasting to chronic stress, and from high to low intensity. And cognition may vary from habit to reinforcement or goal-directed learning, and short-term to long-term memory. Now let's imagine that all these dimensions of stress and cognition form two separate casino roulettes, like this shown in this figure. And these roulettes spin and stop at some point. It is the combination of the different dimensions related to both stress and cognition that can determine the outcome of their interaction. For example, if it's going to be beneficial or impairing. To make this point more clear, taking this roulette metaphor, in chapter 2 of this thesis, we investigated how acute stress induced by a task impacts reinforcement learning about costs and benefits. But what is reinforcement learning? People are driven by certain outcomes, and these outcomes can motivate them to take certain actions and restrict them from taking others. Reinforcement learning theory states that behaviors with positive consequences tend to be repeated, and behaviors with negative consequences tend to be avoided. For example, as kids, your parents might have asked you and your siblings to wash their car, while offering some money for it. Money in this case is the positive outcome. And after getting it, you would probably accept to wash their car again next time they ask. Now let's assume that your siblings got older and they don't want to wash the car anymore. So your parents ask you to wash their car for the same amount of money. However, this time you need to spend more time and effort to complete this task. Effort in this case is the negative outcome, and you would probably consider not accepting their offer next time they ask. This kind of reward-effort trade-off, weighting the costs against the benefits of an action, is involved in numerous of our daily decisions. For example, when deciding to go to the gym, or study for some hard exams, or even accepting a job offer. And impairments in either or the trade-off have been linked with several symptoms of psychopathology, such as anhedonia, which is the inability to get pleasure from positive things, and apathy, which is the inability to engage in activities that require effort. For these reasons, many tasks have been developed in the field of psychology to evaluate and quantify this kind of behavior. So in chapter 2 of this thesis, we used one of these tasks to evaluate how acute stress impacts reinforcement learning about rewards, which is the positive outcome, and effort, which is the negative outcome. To test this, healthy adults were randomly exposed to a no-stress and an acute stress condition. In the acute stress condition, participants had to put their hand in ice-cold water and do some mental arithmetics while receiving negative feedback from a researcher and watching themselves being recorded in a monitor. Afterwards, they had to complete a computerized task during which they had to learn by trial and error to select images associated with rewards and avoid images associated with effort. An effort in this case was squeezing a grip device with their hands. And what we found is that the no-stress group performed equally well on learning to maximize rewards and minimize efforts, whereas the acute stress group performed significantly better on learning to maximize rewards than minimize effort. So acute stress changed the reward-effort trade-off and led participants to put more effort in order to gain money. But why did acute stress lead to this learning asymmetry? During this task, we also collected eye tracking data, physiological data such as blood pressure, biological markers of stress, and computational modeling data, which in simple words means that we applied some mathematical algorithms to the data to help us explain the observed behavior. Now, all this data pointed to the involvement of noradrenaline and dopamine in this process, two stress-related neurotransmitters. Acute stress is known to cause a general arousal, increasing levels of dopamine and noradrenaline in the body. So it's possible that because of increases in noradrenaline, people under acute stress did not evaluate effort as hard or negative. And because of greater levels of dopamine, which in the past has been described as the reward neurotransmitter, it's possible that people under acute stress perform better about rewards. However, we should highlight that we used only indirect measures to approximate their activity, so it's very hard to disentangle their action with certainty. So altogether, these results suggest that this combination of dimensions, namely acute stress induced by a task, leads to prioritizing rewarding over costly things. And this can be beneficial, as in this case, or when we want to reach a valuable goal, such as safety, despite high effort cost. However, in a different context, this strategy might also give rise to maladaptive behavior. For example, it might lead to increased substance use or binge eating, which are rewarding things, neglecting potential costs. In chapter 3 of this thesis, we spin the roulette again, and we investigated how chronic stress, induced outside of a task, impacts reinforcement learning. For this reason, 360 people completed a similar reinforcement learning task as in the previous study, and filled in a number of questionnaires about their emotions, including perceived chronic stress. In this study, we found that increased levels of chronic stress were associated with poorer learning for both rewards and effort. So this combination of dimensions led to a different outcome. It led to a general reduction in reinforcement learning, independent of whether it was learning from positive or negative things. Next, we wanted to delve deeper into the involvement of dopamine and noradrenaline in this process, as we observed earlier. So in chapter 4 of this thesis, we used pharmacological manipulation to target these neurotransmitters more directly. And we investigated their role in cost and benefit decision-making. This time, healthy volunteers could receive 3 drugs, either placebo, which is an inactive substance, or propranolol, that targets noradrenaline, or haloperidol, that targets dopamine. Afterwards, they had to complete a computerized task during which they they had to decide if they were willing to accept a money offer in exchange for some reward. In exchange for some effort, sorry. An effort, again, was squeezing a grip device with their hands. Interestingly, both neurotransmitters showed effects in effort processing. Particularly, people that received propranolol were less willing to exert effort. And people that received haloperidol were squeezing the grip device stronger. However, they were accepting less offers over time. So these results suggest that dopamine and noradrenaline have distinct but complementary effects in effort processing. Noradrenaline may play an important role in controlling how conservative or liberal we can be with our effort production. And dopamine may play an important role in controlling the strength or vigor we use to approach rewarding things. In chapter 5 of the thesis, we spin the roulette one more time, and we investigated how COVID-19-related worries impacted emotion regulation in the initial phase of the pandemic. Adults living in the Netherlands and Belgium repeatedly filled in a number of questionnaires about their emotions. We used network analysis to investigate how these feelings were related to each other. And we found that COVID-19-related worries were consistently associated with higher distress, as indicated by the green color of the line, and lower positive mood, as indicated by the red color of the line. In turn, distress and mood were associated with other feelings, such as loneliness, energy, and motivation. Interestingly, when we looked at whether these variables can predict each other over time, we saw that COVID-19-related worries at day 1 could predict higher distress the following day and lower positive mood the following day. We also noticed that distress and positive mood interacted with each other, creating a cycle during which increased distress at day 1 could predict lower positive mood the following day, and vice versa. So overall, these findings showed that COVID-19-related worries were associated with heightened negative emotional states. Thus, they can provide a mechanistic explanation on the increased psychological complaints observed during the pandemic. To conclude, the goal of this thesis was to investigate parts of the interactions between the multiple dimensions of stress and cognition. Findings of this thesis shows how their interactions can lead to very different outcomes. Here, for example, acute stress led to better reward than effort learning. Chronic stress led to a general reduction in both reward and effort learning. Pharmacological manipulation of dopamine and noradrenaline, two stress-related neurotransmitters, led to changes in effort processing. And worries about the pandemic led to changes in emotion regulation. And these are only a few possibilities. Thus, as we can see, investigating and mapping the different dimensions of both stress and cognition from molecular to behavioral level can be an extremely complex process. But it can help us delineate some very complicated interactions and get a more clear understanding about certain behaviors observed during both mental illness and health. With this, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I will give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. Before we start with the opposition, I would like to welcome the promotion team, which is Supervisor Professor Van Amersfoort, with a chair in transitional psychiatry, with a co-supervisor, Dr. Hernaus, with an expertise area in human psychopharmacology, and a co-supervisor, Dr. Vingerhoets, with an expertise in genetics and developmental diseases. So now we move on to the opposition, and the opposition will be opened by the chair of the assessment committee and professor in affective neuroscience, Professor Scheurs. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, dear candidate, I'd like to congratulate you with your wonderful work. I deeply admire the work that you've done for this thesis. I admire the fact that it's soundly theory-driven, and I particularly admire the experimental rigor in that is clearly apparent in all of your experiments. So my congratulations to you and to your supervisory team. I do have a few questions for you, some things I would like your opinion on, more or less. And I'd like to start with chapter 2 and the premise of that chapter. You seem to start with the expectation that stress will increase reward learning after prioritizing reward learning versus effort learning. This is what you find. I don't dispute the findings, but I would like to hear your opinion on the hypothesis at the beginning, because I find it rather counterintuitive. Why, under circumstances of stress, would I prioritize reward? And if I look at your introduction, you cite challenges in the daily environment, fight or flight responses, suggesting to me that your frame of mind is like circumstances of threat, and I struggle to understand where does your expectation come from? Why would you expect that under these circumstances reward learning would be prioritized? Could you enlighten me?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the kind words and thank you for your interesting question. In this case, we have, first of all, acute stress, which differs a bit from chronic stress in the mechanism of action. So we do test reinforcement learning, and they have to choose, for example, reward and effort. So one mechanism that we think this works is that basically acute stress increases levels of energy in the body, increases our energy availability. But at the same time, it also restricts our cognitive ability. So the fact that the combination that we have more energy in the body probably leads to not thinking so much about doing things. So we don't have in mind the effort process. And the restriction in cognitive part leads to prioritizing one modality over the other. So probably that's why it leads to prioritizing reward, which also in nature it's people most driven from reward than effort. And then, because they don't really think about the effort because there is the energy to execute the effort production, basically. It's not taking into account as much in the cognitive process. This can be a bit, sorry.
No, I was wondering, are you now saying that it's kind of the effect on reward is kind of a byproduct of the effect on effort learning? Or am I misunderstanding you now?
Here we have the trade-off. So basically reward takes priority over effort.
Mm-hmm. I would expect the opposite, to be honest.
We do see, though, in very acute stress conditions that people actually really try to approach rewarding things. We do see that in eating disorders where people really try to approach food as a reward, or in substance use when people really turn to substance, which is a rewarding thing, mm-hmm. to somehow maybe alleviate the symptoms they feel by the stress. So this can be one mechanism that explains this kind of behavior.
Okay. Reading through your chapter, I came up with some alternative hypothesis of mine that I'd like your opinion on as well. Rather than modeling acute stress in general, I was thinking maybe what you're modeling, as you explained in your beautiful presentation, What this experiment involves is that people, okay, they put their hands in cold water and they receive negative feedback, basically, and they're supposedly filmed, not really, but supposedly. Could it be that as a response to that, they just simply crave positive reinforcement? They say, okay, now I've been negatively judged, now I'm going to look for positive judgment, and it's rather a very specific effect of the type of stress modeling that you do, rather than a general effect of stress. So, in other words, your experiment or your model doesn't capture the general effect of stress. Am I making myself clear?
I think so.
So would you agree or not, is my first question, to my alternative hypothesis?
Could you remind me which?
In brief, it's not a general stress effect that you're measuring, it's a very specific thing, a very specific response to the very specific circumstances of your setting. So in other words, it's not generalizable to the real world.
Yeah, I think the fact that we do see in real world that people under acute stress do seek rewarding things kind of justifies that it's not just specific to the stress test itself. And it can be generalized to different occasions in the real life world.
So you don't agree? Which is perfectly
not necessarily.
Fine. No, okay, fine. Thank you. I'm happy with your answer. I'm going to give the word back to our chairman.
Thank you. Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Klaas. We are happy to have you here as a member of the assessment committee, as well as here at the opposition. The University of Maastricht very much likes to have foreign, outside evaluation. He's professor in psychiatry. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I lost sight of the room. Now I see the candidate again. Okay, nice to see you. Yeah, first of all, of course, I would also like to congratulate you on a very nice thesis of high scientific quality, an impressive number of studies, nice publications. So really well done, and also my congratulations to your promoter team, of course. Yeah. So thank you very much for that. First, I would like to discuss with you a little bit about the task you used to measure reward sensitivity. I didn't know the task in advance. I saw in your thesis it was adapted from Skvortsova, if I remember that name correctly. We, in our research, we used a different task, which was a Pizzagalli task, which with a face, round face, and short and long mouth. So I would like to know, why exactly did you use this task? Why did you adapt it from an existing task? And why did you not maybe go back to the classical Pizzagalli task? So could you explain a little bit about the task and why you actually chose this one?
Yeah, the reason we chose this task is that we wanted to evaluate the reward-effort trade-off with, highly esteemed opponent. I'm sorry, thank you for your kind words, first of all. Thank you for the compliments about my thesis. Yeah, to come back to your question, one of the reasons we chose this task is because we wanted to evaluate this reward-effort trade-off. This task was very nicely implementing this to Parkinson's disease patients to evaluate how they balance the reward and effort trade-off in their learning and their decision-making. So we thought it was a very great fit for our hypothesis. And we adapted it a bit to fit the purpose of our study, basically.
And what did you adapt exactly?
We adapted, for example, the effort levels, because people with Parkinson's disease do have some motor problems, so the thresholds there were a bit lower. We adapted the reward levels to kind of make them equal with the effort levels that we used, and we increased a bit some numbers of trials. Okay,
thank you. That is clear. Yeah, I'm more familiar to depression research also, and there, of course, these kind of tasks are often used as a proxy for anhedonia. For non-people, I've seen that in some of your studies you also use the SHAPS, the Snaith-Hamilton anhedonia and pleasure questionnaire scale. In your opinion, does reward sensitivity task, computerized, the one you used, or the Pizzagalli task, does it really fit with anhedonia as a clinical symptom, which is measured by the SHAPS, for example, or are these two different dimensions, in your opinion?
I think they might reflect more different levels of the same dimension. SAPS and anhedonia is more of a symptom that we do see in patient groups, but reward sensitivity we can see also in the general population. So I think both can both measure reward related aspects, but SAPS maybe it's more applied to patient groups, and we could apply this kind of tasks in both patients and general population, and get this kind of maybe in a way dimensionality that we want. Many groups actually, I know that they do want to try to also have these tasks as screening, for example, for reward sensitivity traits. So the short answer is that I think they both reflect reward aspects, but maybe on the different levels. Yeah.
Okay. I think I'm not really sure, but chapter 3, I think you used both the SHAPS and the reward sensitivity task. Did you look at that? Did you compare? Did you make some kind of, I don't know what, correlation analysis to see whether results on the SHAPS and results on the reward sensitivity task are correlated in some way?
Exactly. Yeah, we did use a reward task and SAPS questionnaires there, and we did multi-level regressions to see if these questionnaires, among with some other questionnaires that we were investigated, correlate with this task. And interestingly, we didn't see associations. And we think that this is because of the fact that we measure the general population that has not developed yet feelings of anhedonia. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think to answer this question, and I completely agree with your answers, but when you do it in depressive patients, often you don't see a correlation either. And the reason is that maybe they are really measuring some different aspects, and anhedonia, being able to enjoy things, may not be really the same as trying to get a reward. But it's a very complex phenomenological discussion, a lot of discussion among psychiatrists as well. So I'm completely happy with your answer. If I get 1 or 2 more minutes, I would like to.
Yeah, okay.
One
more minute.
1 more minute. Okay, then a brief question, maybe also from my side. I'm a psychiatrist, as you know. So I saw that in chapter 3, you found no group difference on accuracy between participants with different psychiatric diagnoses, which you were a little bit surprised about, I think, whether people had depression or something else or not. Accuracy was the same, if I interpreted chapter 3 correctly. Is that right?
Sorry, but the acoustics are not great. Could you maybe repeat your question?
Oh, I think in chapter 3, you looked at accuracy on the tasks, and you see no difference, no group difference between participants with different psychiatric diagnoses.
Yes.
So I just a brief question. Yeah, I hear myself 2 times now. Is psychiatric diagnosis was just assessed by asking patients, do you have a psychiatric diagnosis, and which one is it? So do you think that's reliable way to assess psychiatric diagnosis?
Yeah, so in this study, we did have a very small sample size of people that self-reported that were diagnosed with depression or anxiety. Only 20 or 30 people per group. It's really not a big sample, especially for an online study. So I think it's very hard to make any conclusions with this sample about different diagnostics group.
Okay. So would you agree that maybe the fact that you didn't find anything is also due to maybe lack of power, or also lack of reliable diagnosis, basically, because it's just self-report? Would you agree with that?
It could be either. It could be both. We do have a very small sample size, so it's hard to make any conclusions. But also, people in this task self-reported their diagnosis, and we do mention that in the limitations of their study, that it's possible that it might have led to some bias of not reporting maybe the right diagnosis, or it's possible that they didn't receive this diagnosis from a professional. So I think, it's just very hard to judge, in this case, the different diagnostic groups because of both factors.
Thank you very much, dear candidate. And with that, I would like to hand the word back to the chair.
Thank you. And now the opposition will be continued by Associate Professor Waltz. He was member of the assessment committee. Expertise is in learning and decision-making in psychology. And he's from the University of Maryland and online present. I guess it will be switched now.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, I very much enjoyed reading your thesis. I was particularly impressed by the inventive way in which you examine the impact of stress and trauma on the ability to learn about reward, the ability to learn about effort cost. I was also impressed by the way in which you use pharmacological manipulations to address this topic. The fact that your doctoral work has already led to 4 peer-reviewed publications speaks to the quality of the work. I'd like to ask or to discuss chapter 2 with you. In this chapter, you had stress and no stress groups. One question I had was, did you consider having all of the subjects do both the stress and no stress conditions?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. So this task is a reinforcement learning task. And it was inspired by previous work, but we developed it in our lab. We haven't tested if there can be potential learning effects within sessions. So we think we thought it's better to adopt a between subject designs to avoid potential differences that we see in the results because of some learning effects. Now, I know that this task is a probabilistic task, so people do not necessarily do not know in the end if an image is associated for sure with a reward or an effort. And we could have changed the images between sessions to minimize these learning effects. However, I have performed the task myself, and I have talked to people to pilot subjects that have also performed these tasks maybe more than one time. And I think it's possible that we do get the strategy that they should use in this task, how this task works. So even though they cannot really associate stimulus with outcomes, it's possible that they know the strategy behind it, and in the next session, this exploration phase that people have when learning the optimal choice might become shorter, and we might interpret that as a maybe faster learning effect. So just to avoid this kind of misinterpretations, and since we haven't validated for potential learning effects, we just thought it was safer to follow a between subject design.
Thank you, dear candidate. Regarding chapter 4, I had several questions. One was, why did you decide to use a dopamine stimulant and a norepinephrine depressant? Other possibilities might have included using a reuptake inhibitor for dopamine and a norepinephrine enhancer. Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. So I will redirect a bit the focus to chapter 2, in which we saw that how acute stress that increases levels of dopamine and noradrenaline in the body. We evaluate increases in both neurotransmitters. So in chapter 4, we wanted to evaluate decreases in neurotransmitters, in these neurotransmitters. So we wanted to focus on antagonists. We also wanted to focus, with regards to dopamine, on the 2 receptor antagonists, because they have shown effects in reward processing, but also in effort processing. And we wanted to focus on beta receptors with regards to noradrenaline, because they do show effects in energy expenditure. Now, both haloperidol and propranolol had this mechanism of action. That's why they gain our attention. And then we talked to other groups that have used these drugs. And they told us that, we could really see effects in these drugs, even in low doses, without seeing side effects. And for us, this was very important to maintain the well-being of our participants. Now, the fact that haloperidol acted as an agonist, it wasn't intentional. And it's for sure a limitation in our study, and we acknowledge that. But we can still get very important information about their involvement in effort processing, and kind of a step to disentangle their action between noradrenaline and dopamine.
One other question I had is how you made decisions about dosing. How did you arrive at 2 milligrams of haloperidol and 40 milligrams of propranolol? And in general, how does one determine whether one is as stimulating as the other is depressing?
Is it possible to give a short answer so that we move on with the other opponents?
Yeah, I'll try. So the dosing, as I mentioned earlier, it was because we talked to other groups, and they did tell us that we would see an effect in very low doses without seeing side effects. And we kind of assumed that, determined that it's a stimulant because we see that increases, for example, that haloperidol increases response vigor, which is something that has been reported in the literature, that increased dopamine increases response vigor. So based on our results and the literature that we saw, we can say that it was a stimulant and not a depressant. And for propranolol, we have used blood pressure and physiological markers, and we see that they decrease over time. So we can say that it acted as an antagonist, and it reduced blood pressure in the body. So it actually, reduced the levels of noradrenaline.
Thank you, dear candidate. Mr. Prorector, I had one other question if I had time.
No, there is no time. I'm sorry. We would like to give also the other opponents the opportunity to discuss with the candidates. So maybe later on, but for now, the opposition will be continued with Professor Riedel. He's Professor of Experimental Psychopharmacology at the University of Maastricht.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear candidates, first of all, my compliments for this achievement, also to your supervisory team. I'm happy to memorize that we have a history as teacher and student, because you and also the paranymph to your right were in the very first cohort of students of drug development and neurohealth in the research master. So it is therefore very rewarding to me to speak to you in this position, because you can now assume the role to teach me, and I'm only asking the questions. And of course, do you prefer to continue the discussion you had with the previous opponent about chapter 4, or do you want me to ask a question about chapter 6?
Whatever you prefer.
Sorry?
Whatever you prefer.
I prepared both. Okay, in that case, I continue about chapter 4, because I'm highly intrigued by the data you found on the effects of haloperidol on reward processing and response vigor. And I can throw in some different explanations or ask you which explanations did not make it in the article.
Sorry?
Which explanations why haloperidol, you even said haloperidol acted as an agonist, and I'm very curious to know why you think so. And if there were other explanations for this, because I had also expected that haloperidol would reduce vigor, response vigor. So my first question is, what is the real explanation for the fact that this result turned opposite to what you hypothesized?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the kind words and reminding me of the years as a master student. And thank you for your question. Yeah, so we have used haloperidol in a very low doses. And in the literature, it is evident that when we use haloperidol in very low doses, which acts in dopamine 2 receptors, it can actually lead to this difference in the mechanism of action. And instead of decreasing lowers of dopamine, it increases them. So this, in combination with the results we found that it increased response vigor, which is something that we indeed expect when dopamine is increased, it makes us have the assumption that it was that haloperidol acted as an agonist in this case. Yeah. So it was basically what we see, it was what we read in the literature, and we make this conclusion that I think it's very, very well defined, and we really, we make this conclusion that it acted as an agonist instead of antagonist in this case.
And this was I would say that's a speculation rather than a conclusion. Do you agree?
I think we're quite confident to say that that was the mechanism of action. We don't have direct measures to really quantify the levels of dopamine. But again, based on the literature, based on the mechanism of action on this kind of drug, that in low doses, it acts presynaptically, so it increases the level of dopamine. We do see that the effects we see, it's basically associated with increases in dopamine. We can be maybe 90 or 80% sure that this has to do with the fact that dopamine levels are increased.
Okay, then maybe I put a suggestion to you for an alternative explanation. And you have to think about the inverted U between, on the one hand, stress and arousal, and on the other hand, also same for dopamine and performance. So what about your subjects were a bit nervous, stressed by whatever they encountered on this day in your laboratory, And they were, to put it simply, they were too high on dopamine. So they were over the top of the inverted U. So their performance was actually worse than normal. So you give them a little bit of dopamine antagonist, a very low dose. You explained that clearly. And this may have caused to move them to the top of the inverted U because they came from the other side. Would that not be a simpler explanation?
So when we recruited these participants, we really had an extensive screening, for example, to really make sure that we have healthy population without maybe differences in dopamine and noradrenaline levels, not conditions that affect these neurotransmitters or no use of drugs that can affect these neurotransmitters. And we also have some questionnaires, including working memory questionnaire, which has been associated with levels of dopamine and noradrenaline as well. And we do see that the groups do not differ, for example, in these measures. So we could say that indirectly, we have some indirect measures that the levels of dopamine and noradrenaline at baseline were not massively different. And the stress induction, it happens sometimes that in the beginning of an experimental session, participants are very stressed, trying to see what's happening, what is going to happen in this session. But this session lasted for many hours because we had to wait for the drugs to act. We had to wait at least 1 to 2 hours for the drugs to act. So I think even if they were stressed in the beginning, by the time of the task, their levels have dropped, the levels of stress could have dropped. So indirectly, we can say that we probably don't see this kind of effects with regards to stress and dopamine baseline levels in our groups.
Thank you. I have more, but I give the word back to the pro-rector.
The opposition will now be continued by Professor Blokland. He is secretary of this committee and having a chair in comparative neuroscience at Maastricht University.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, also my congratulations for this nice thesis and the work you described in the different chapters with interesting studies. And of course, I also want to congratulate your team that supported you during these years as a PhD student, which can be very stressful. Probably made the right decisions, and I assume you put enough effort in it to come to this thesis. I also had some questions about chapter 2 because I was reading the methods and trying to understand the task. And maybe we can have a discussion later, or maybe with your supervisory team. But I still not really, I would not think that would be. But I have many questions, but maybe for later. But since we have already discussed the task and you already gave some great answers also to the other questions, I would like to move to a chapter that is not discussed yet, which is chapter 5, which is about the COVID study. And it is nice to describe what you find, but I think you were only scratching the surface of this study. And you already mentioned some of the limitations. So what I see from the network correlations on page 137, for me, the most, the one that pops up here is the relation between positive mood and distress. Would we expect that in the first case? Is it specific for COVID? So let's start there for a first question. So is it really COVID related, or is this a general finding that you would find?
I think what is interesting to highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words, and thank you for the compliments, and thank you for the interesting question. I think, the focus on the study is on COVID-19, and it's very interesting to see that COVID-19 was only correlated with distress and positive mood. and with COVID-19 guidelines, and not the other indicators of mental well-being. And I think it's also very interesting that, for example, if we compare with other network studies, that they used similar approaches to test depression and anxiety networks, that they also see highly centrality in these two indicators of well-being, positive and mood and distress. So I think that it's very interesting to see that in both depression and anxiety and in COVID, these two indicators are really play a very central role in the networks. So what we think about that is that exactly because COVID-19 affected this, it's possible that in the long term, it could be an explanation on the psychological complaints we do see during COVID-19. So yeah, distress and mood are very central in this network, but COVID-19 only affects that, and then these two affect other indicators of well-being.
Okay. So what do you think of the other correlations you find when you look at the product moment correlations? Like when I look at the table 3 on page 136, like the correlation between positive mood and loneliness of a correlation of 0.14. It's significant, but does it really mean anything, do you think?
It does mean that positive mood affects loneliness. And that's the point of the network, that we do see how certain factors...
Yeah, I understand, but do you think it's relevant to find a correlation of 0.14, minus 0.14, as a correlation coefficient? Do you think that's meaningful, a meaningful correlation?
Yeah.
Do we think we have to draw conclusions from this correlation?
Yeah. So I have to highlight here that the beta values we use are raw data. They don't, we cannot interpret them as standardized data, that 1.4 is low correlation and 0.7 is very high correlation. So these values are interpreted in a different way. So we cannot really say that 0.14 is the strength, the way we interpret it with standardized beta.
Okay, but my question, do you think it's relevant or not, this correlation?
Of course, all of these correlations are relevant in this network. They explain how the feelings are associated with each other. Yeah. It's just not the focus of our paper. Because later on, when we measure lag associations, we don't see this correlation as significant. Okay. Meaning that it doesn't predict that positive mood at day one doesn't predict loneliness the following day, just at the moment.
Okay, considering the time, I would like to have one other question. So you already mentioned your limitations that, of course, you didn't look at socio-demographic variables or stratifying the data. But, I mean, you just did the analysis of all the age groups. But I can imagine that for something like health-related issues in the age from 16 to 20, it's very different from 51 to 60 or 41 to 50. So is that a correct assumption that I have, or did you have a look at that, if there were differences in the correlation between these measures? And what would you expect? Do you expect differences between these age groups?
We haven't looked at differences between groups in this sample. And we do mention that in the limitation that it would, in the future directions, that it would be interesting to have a closer look to that. But very interestingly, AIDS has been described as one of risk factors that predict worse mental health outcomes during COVID-19. And being younger in AIDS actually seems to be a predictor that leads to worse mental health outcomes. So it is possible that these age groups differ in a way in how they react during COVID-19. And it's definitely interesting in the future to delve deeper into these age group differences.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answers, and I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you. And now the opposition will be continued by Dr. Kwaadvlieg. She is member of the assessment committee, and expertise area is stress resilience from Maastricht University.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, I also would like to congratulate you, especially what I said before, like the broad palette of research methods, technique that are in the thesis are really impressive. I do want to add also that I appreciate that the chapters or the publications are open access, that you share the scripts and all these things. In that view, I also think you not only contribute to the field, but to science, open science in general. And to that, I also would like to include the promotion team. My questions are more about one of the main topics, stress, and how we can define and measure it. And I would like to ask questions based or using chapter 2. So maybe one step back. So if I'm reading the thesis, the second sentence in the introduction states, I will read it out loud to make sure that I'm not mistakenly quoting you. When it comes to stress research, it can be surprisingly difficult to pinpoint what exactly stress is. And I do agree with that, but I do hope that we now can here speculate a bit and dive into like how we think that we can measure it. So in chapter 2, if we're looking into all the measures that you have pupil, alpha amylase, cortisol, blood pressure, subjective stress. So you have the whole palette of stress measures that can be used. I was a bit puzzled by the analysis. So if I'm looking to the physiological measures that are discussed on page 32 at the top, you nicely have for the cortisol, you explain this condition times interaction, and you have looked into the area under the curve increase, which is a standardized measure to do. Though for alpha amylase, you only report a difference in this area under the curve increase, and I don't see any report about the time times condition interaction, though you had multiple samples. So my first short question about it is why? Why only looking into the area on the curve for this measure? And could you take into account or also speculate a bit about what it would mean for the definition of stress, how we should measure it?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Thank you for the compliments. Very interesting questions. The reason why we didn't use another index for measuring alpha amylase is that we do have quite convincing evidence with all the measures we use that we do see group differences with regards to stress levels, like all the measurements we've used are quite convincingly tell us that we do see increases in all of the instances that we wanted to measure. We focused a bit more on cortisol just because it's the most known and the most well-studied marker of stress. Many studies don't really focus on alpha amylase. We thought it's a very interesting factor to measure as well, and we do think that by reporting the area under the curve with respect to increase gives us the information we want with regards to differences in the group level. For sure, it would have been interesting to also see how they vary over time. And I would definitely have that in mind for a future study, to also have that maybe as a supplement if it's too much information and a figure to put for a stress, for example. Your second question was how, if I'm not mistaken, how to define measures of stress?
Well, how in your view, because I saw indeed there was this focus on cortisol, if there was kind of with an idea that you also think that mainly if you want to measure stress, that this is the main output that you should focus on. Because you did have multiple measures of alpha amylase as well, right?
Yeah.
At least so you could have done that.
Yeah.
Is it with an idea that you think that the definition of stress is also more linked to the cortisol response?
I think we have very convincing evidence to say that this is not the case. There's many, many other factors that have been affected during a stress response.
You may finish your answer or not.
Yeah, we definitely have more measures than just cortisol that we should take into account when evaluating stress.
Good, thank you.
Okay. Styliani Dialechti Voulgaropoulou, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Please all rise.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Styliani, I will start. Styliani Dialechti Voulgaropoulou. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense, and in view of this positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor van Amersfoort is authorized to confer upon this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Please, all rise. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee hereby present, I hereby confer upon you, Styliani Dialechti Voulgaropoulou, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Dear Dr. Voulgaropoulou, luckily I had a few years of practice your last name. Dear Stella, you did it. Congratulations on this incredible achievement. You delivered a very impressive thesis and a very strong defense. It feels like yesterday, Therese and I were contacted by Professor Riedel, who is also here in the committee today, asking if we needed a talented master student for one of our projects. Of course, we were interested. And so began your time at our department. And Professor Riedel was right. We quickly get to know you as an intelligent and driven researcher. You indeed had a talent for writing, and because of that I gave you an additional task, to write a systematic review besides your master thesis. And I think we both at the time didn't expect that this little occupational therapy project turned out into a widely cited paper that actually made it into your booklet. After a successful internship, you also wanted to do a PhD at the department. And as it happens, we were looking for one at the time, and so you stayed. And of course, I was very happy with that, especially since you didn't like the poor coffee at the department as well. And you and Sam bought your own espresso machine, which I have gratefully used over the years, promising to provide some coffee as well, which I naturally always forgot. But today is the day. But your PhD not only consisted of nice coffee moments, of course. You worked on a complicated topic and had to learn advanced statistics and computational modeling, which you did and made it look very easy as well. And like every PhD trajectory, there were a few hurdles as well, including a worldwide pandemic. But you never complained and kept on going, solving all problems along the way. Perhaps your biggest struggle was designing the cover of your booklet. Perfectionist as you are, you had designed multiple options in slightly different shades. And although the color turned out a little different than you expected, it became a very beautiful and stylish book. And in my opinion, the complex, ever-changing shade does justice to its content. Stella, not only have I enjoyed our scientific discussions over the years, but also our more personal conversations on various topics, from exchanging recipes, especially Greek recipes for me, and complaining about the weather, of course. With your Mediterranean roots, you sometimes struggled with the Dutch weather, not enough sun, and too much rain, even today. Perhaps you are just very well integrated in the Netherlands, as we Dutchies love to complain about the weather as well. All joking aside, I really enjoyed working with you these last few years, and I hope you will stick around, despite the horrible weather here. I'm convinced that a great career lies ahead for you, but for now, enjoy this very special day. But first, Dr. Hernaus also has a few words of praise for you.
Thank you, Claudia. Dear Dr. Stella, well, she said Dr. Voulgaropoulou, so I'll say Dr. Stella. Sounds good, doesn't it? The benefit of working with multiple supervisors is that on a day like this, we get a moment to remind you of all the adventures you've been through in the last almost 5 years. And you met the formidable Dr. Vingerhoets, I think, earlier in time, but we didn't meet until 2018, September 11, 2018 to be exact. I remember meeting you on this day for a potential PhD position with this wonderful supervision team. And to give you an idea of potential projects, I mentioned a few topics, some methods, a timeline even, and what I remember is that all the while you sat there listening intently, like a modern-day Plato or Aristotle, I would imagine. But a day or two after we said our goodbyes, I received an email from you, an email in which you expressed a genuine interest in the topic, but also an email with good questions about the potential approach and clearly indicating what you did not know about the topic yet. I think then and there, I already saw the real Stella, thinking it out, planning ahead, and asking the right questions. As with any PhD, yours was filled with challenges. You started working on an fMRI emotion recognition paradigm. That didn't exactly work out as intended. You collected data using a difficult cost-benefit reinforcement learning task, which frequently crashed, if you remember. That didn't work out as intended. You ran a pharmacology study in which you collected data using 2 challenging tasks. Together, they didn't work out as intended. And then there was the COVID-19 pandemic, which ensured that nothing happened as it was intended. But all the while, you remained cool and composed and motivated, at least from the outside. And to stay within the context of your thesis, you kept putting in the effort despite the stress. Your first lab study was on hold during the COVID pandemic. No problem, you shifted to an online paradigm. Due to the COVID pandemic, some original plans for studies changed. You focused your attention on the Dane study. For that study, we needed to recruit 150 participants. No problem, you got it all done. I genuinely admire your ability to pull these things off during a worldwide pandemic. Throughout your PhD, you became a data collector. I quickly did the math for you. You collected about data from about 250 people in the lab together with your army of interns and about 500 online data sets. But you didn't only become a data collector, you also became a COVID collector. Every time when you would fly out to any place, you love traveling the world, we would fear that you would come back with a new collection, a new addition to the collection. We would jokingly say that you were collecting the Greek alphabet. But jokes aside, this was a challenging period, personally and professionally. But even then, you kept things going. Another example of your willingness to exert effort in exchange for reward. Also, in light of this worldwide pandemic, I have to admit that near the end of your PhD, I and the other 2 formidable supervisors were a little bit nervous. Would there be enough data, enough papers? But during this phase, the Stella Paper Production Company opened up for business. In the last year, you, oops, I have to turn it around like this. You wrote and revised and published 2 papers, and another excellent one is on the way. And at the same time, you got your first opportunities to enjoy a normal PhD life. Nice trips to Lisbon and Barcelona, San Diego, which rumor has it was intensely enjoyable. And these work-related activities did sometimes interfere a little bit with your love for traveling the world. For example, when your tour of the Sagrada Familia was scheduled at the exact same time as an important work meeting, maybe the only example where your ability to meticulously plan it out didn't work as intended. Stella, it was a pleasure to work with you throughout this wild ride. Thank you for allowing us to be your supervisors. I'm glad that we still have some time to finalize some projects. And after that, this thesis, I'm sure, will be an excellent starting point for any adventures that will come. For the final words, I am going to try it. I would like to turn to your family, and I practiced this morning, and would like to say, Sichariteria yafto to megalo epitevma. Congratulations, Stella, on behalf of all of us. I have spoken.
Okay, dear Dr. Stella, also on behalf of the Maastricht University, I congratulate you, your family, Spiros, relatives, friends and colleagues with this degree which you acquired. You did a wonderful job. I myself am a pain researcher, more molecular biology, and I very much like this discussion. I think I can learn a lot from that. And as you know, when I saw the title of your thesis, Modeling the Brain, I thought, oh my God, that's broad. And then you focus on mechanisms on stress and learning and cognition, which you defended today and discussed. And you might be aware that pain is really closely related to that. So I can learn a lot, and I learned a lot today, including the role of dopamine, which is also involved in pain. So thank you for that. And now a few logistical things. First of all, after I close this session, there will be the opportunity for the guests from outside and you and the team to make a picture here in front of the desk. So then we will stand here and there will be a picture been made. The foreign opponents will then also be having the opportunity to congratulate you. After that, we will move outside and go to the stairs. And there will also be a picture with the team and opposition and with you. And if you want, family can join. And after that, there is the reception. So with that, I will close this session. And we go over to making the pictures.